Once again, thank you all for being here, for participating in this Digital Humanities Hangout that is co-organized by Lancaster Digital Humanities Hub by the Ghent Digital Humanities Center for the Digital Humanities Lab in the new University of Lisbon in Portugal. Today with us we have Stuart Dunn. I'm going to make a brief presentation on Stuart and his work, and then he will start. As normal, we ask to you all to keep the mic and the camera off. And if you want to make some interaction, make any comments or questions, you can use the meeting chat. We only ask if you want to make some question to put the word question in the beginning in caps, so we can in the end identify all the questions, and then Stuart can answer them. Stuart is a senior lecturer in Digital Humanities and head of the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London. His background is archaeology, and he developed an interest and research on history of cartography, on spatial humanity, on spatial narrative theory, and critical GIS, among other areas. He is also a visiting scholar in Stanford University's Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis. He has several publications on subjects regarding digital humanities and spatial humanities, from digital narratives about cultural heritage to digital representation of place, crowdsourcing, deep mapping, and other subjects. Among many other references, he published recently the book A History of Place in the Digital Age in 2019, and as another in preparation this year, probably will come out in July or August, titled Handbook on Research Methods in Digital Humanities. For me, it's a pleasure to re-encounter Stuart. We met in Indianapolis in 2012 for Summer Institute on Deep Mapping and Spatial Narratives. And now Stuart is talking to us today about growing up tall and proud, place and the internet from the Cold War to COVID. Once again, Stuart, many thanks for accepting this invitation to being here, presenting your work and discussing this subject. So the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation to participate. I think this is an absolutely wonderful idea to kind of keep the flame of digital humanities burning throughout COVID, to have Hangouts like this. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to come along for this one. So I have started with the official opening slide, but I also have my own unofficial slide, which I think I need to show in order to explain the wry humor behind my presentation title, Growing Up Tall and Proud, Placing the Internet from the Cold War to COVID. So Growing Up Tall and Proud is from the lyrics of the 1984 Queen song, Hammer to Fall, Growing Up Tall and Proud in the Shadow of the Mushroom Cloud, which was a reference to the pervasive fear at the time of nuclear annihilation through the Cold War. However, I think Growing Up Tall and Proud in the Shadow of a Mushroom Cloud also very much applies to the birth and development and history of the internet. So the origins of the internet have been much discussed in contemporary history. And one kind of common theme is the role of the Cold War and the pressures of geopolitics in the second half of the 20th century that were part of that process of the internet and eventually the World Wide Web developing. Incidentally, my students learned very early on that a way to make me extremely grumpy is to forget that the internet and the World Wide Web are completely different things, but I'm going to come to that in a little while. But what I would like to do in the course of this discussion is think a little bit about our frameworks for the study of internet history, and particularly think about the role of place as a factor in the development of the internet, but also our conceptual and geographical relationship to information. So in that vein, there are two questions that I'm going to be looking at in the next half hour or so. So how does technology compress time and space? When I say technology, I mean primarily network technologies. And why does technology compress time and space? What are the historical imperatives that drive that process? And I don't know, is this window visible on my slide? It's this small one in the corner. Do I need to hide it? Anyway, but what I'm going to argue is that the history of the internet and the web can be seen as a framework in terms of the detachment and reconnection of us humans and the information we create. And I want to look a little bit at how that has become far more complex as the internet has become mobile, as it has gone from our desktops to our pockets. So that's the menu for this afternoon. Now my slides aren't moving forward. Let me see if I can sort this out. There we go. So the compression of time and space. Okay, this is by no means a new idea. So space-time compression is an idea which was floated by Doreen Massey, the feminist Marxist geographer, in a landmark paper that she published in Marxism Today in 1991, A Global Sense of Place. Now, 1991 is a particularly significant year to be writing about this kind of thing. It comes, well, essentially 2 years after the invention of the World Wide Web by Sir Tim Berners, well, as he was then, Mr. Tim Berners-Lee at CERN in near Geneva. But in this article, in A Global Sense of Place, Massey develops the idea that space as a function of cost becomes smaller as technological connectivity increases. Now, I'm not going to read all this out, you'll be relieved to hear, but this passage from A Global Sense of Place encapsulates this idea. So she talks about movement in terms of the proliferation of air travel, of financial flows, of faxes, email, which had been around longer than the World Wide Web, which I'll come to shortly, film distribution networks, all of these things which reduce the time it takes to engage with space, but in various different ways increases the cost. And she notes, very careful to note, that this is a fundamentally unequal process. Not everybody has access to the technologies which compress space and time. So at the bottom there, it says that there is someone in sub-Saharan Africa who can spend hours a day on foot collecting water, while overhead, airliners are taking people between London and Tokyo. So I think we see this landmark article in the context of a world that was becoming smaller, where the internet was becoming embedded, where the World Wide Web had recently been invented, where people were beginning to think about space and place in slightly different ways. Now, of course, the the idea of space-time compression, even if it wasn't particularly called that, is a much older idea or a much older concept. Essentially, it goes back to the 19th century in the form that I am talking about here, with the development of the international and intercontinental telegraph network. So 1850, the first single wireless cable between England and France. 16 years later, is the first transatlantic submarine cable. So this is a process which begins the idea of space-time compression, reducing the connectivity between different places from weeks, in most cases, of sending a letter, to minutes. And I think the idea that Massey promulgates, that this was not an equal process, very much held the same here. In the early periods of global telegraphic connections, they were the preserve, shall we say, of governments, and particularly empires and the wealthy. So yes, this kind of idea of unequal space-time compression has always been there. However, none of these technological information revolutions are the product of a single invention. I think Massey is very careful to be clear that the phenomenon of space-time compression, as she sees it, is multifaceted. It involves air travel, telephone, email, fax, all the different ways that the world was shrinking. But the same is true of the earlier period as well. The telegraph network only came about, it would not have come about, for example, without the discovery of electromagnetic energy in 1820, or indeed the discovery of Morse code, the invention of Morse code by Samuel Morse in 1837. And I have an image there of a label from Sir Charles Wheatstone, as he was the inventor of one of the early telegraphic terminal devices, and he was a professor of experimental philosophy at my institution. So I am patriotically putting my own institutional credentials forward here. But in all cases, this process of space-time compression has been the result of numerous disparate, disconnected, and dyschronological inventions coming together. And I think that's true in the present day as well. Think of an iPhone. The iPhone was not invented in one go, whatever the Steve Jobs mythology might tell us. It was the product of touchscreen technology, lithium battery technology, GPS technology, all of these different inventions which came about at different times and were brought together in a new and intelligent and very innovative way. The early telegraph network and the internet of later periods was no exception to that. So I'm now going to jump forward a little bit and think about the early origins of the internet itself. And I'm going to argue that this was a process, in fact, of disconnection. That sounds slightly kind of counterintuitive, but stay with me and I hope it will make some sort of sense. When I say disconnection, I don't mean disconnection of persons or even disconnection of machines. I mean disconnection of the information we create and ourselves. And the early thinking that drove the development of the internet was, I think, part of this, or this distinction was very important. So a key publication in this space, and Patty was asking about the minion, and the reason for the minion there is it always puts me in mind of this illustration of this paper, of the forehead-mounted camera that this chap is wearing. As we may think, was published by the American engineer and scientist Vannevar Bush in 1945, in which he addressed the proliferation of scientific material and research that had been produced in the run-up to and during the Second World War. So there were masses, you know, in the modern parlance, terabytes, although of course that term wouldn't have applied in 1945, worth of information, scientific reports, publications, books, documenting all the scientific research that had happened in World War II. And Bush's thesis was that there was so much information that the individual scientists had become disconnected from it, because quite simply, there was too much information for in any given field for any specialist in that given field to absorb. So Bush's solution was a theoretical, entirely theoretical machine, which he called the MEMEX. So the MEMEX is essentially a device which can store all of a researcher's books, records, and communications, and which is mechanized, which may be consulted by anybody by the user with exceeding speed and flexibility. Does this sound familiar at all by any chance? So he talks about I mean, he even provided a drawing of the MEMEX in his publication. So he talks about tapping information in and then being able to retrieve it. You know, the user taps a single key and the items, the two items he is looking at, are permanently joined. Now, this sounds conceptually an awful lot like the idea of two web pages being joined, does it not? Now, I think the key concept which is governing Bush's thinking here is the idea that that one scholar, that operator of the MEMEX, retains complete control of all this information. So I think he starts experimenting with the idea of addressing this disconnection through volume, but still the user is in control. And I need my PowerPoint to wake up again. Sorry about this. Okay, so another key flashpoint of the Cold War, which comes 12 years after Bush's paper, in October 1957, is the launch of the Soviet Sputnik satellite. So this was a very key point in the Cold War. So Sputnik was a common or garden communication satellite. There's no scale on here, but it was, I think, no more than 3 or 4 feet across, this metal ball. Very, very unimpressive. But this caused a terrific existential almost angst in the United States, because essentially the USSR had beaten America into space. This also, as demonstrated on the right-hand side there, also demonstrated that as well as having rockets which could take a satellite into orbit, the USSR had rocket technology which could, in theory, deliver nuclear warheads to the US mainland. So against the background of all this scientific research, which Vannevar Bush and others in the previous couple of decades had highlighted, the US government in 1958 set up the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, whose idea was it was set up by, initiated by President Dwight Eisenhower in response to the Sputnik launch. And the idea was to prevent further technological surprises by engaging more systematically with scientific and military research and to anticipate future technological developments. Now, this period also saw a kind of great sort of uptake in popular culture, which looked at the idea of sort of Cold War technology going wrong. So one of my favorite movies from this period is Dr. Strangelove, Peter Sellers, the movie in which Peter Sellers plays, I think, 3, possibly 4 different characters, in which essentially a US Air Force general goes mad and is somehow able to order a nuclear strike on the Soviet Union and start the Third World War. And yes, so there are two of Sellers' further characters. Now, this, I think, starts to touch on some of these important relationships between information and sort of the technology which uses information. So in this movie, information is misappropriated for a particular purpose and technology deployed to kind of enact that purpose. So this is about control of information, control of commands, control of orders. And and I think it is absolutely no coincidence, by the way, that in the period after this, there was a genre of other movies, all of which focused on the idea of sort of information and machines and computers essentially taking on lives of their own. So some of these movies have been forgotten, some less so. So 2001, A Space Odyssey on the left there, for example, Tron on the right hand, and then a Disney movie in the center there. So one of ARPA's main projects in this rapidly evolving universe of information, where the public was starting to get different kinds of messages about what information was and who was in control of it. One of their key projects was the ARPANET. So the ARPANET essentially was about developing hardware which could utilize existing telephone wires, at least from the AAT telephone network, to connect computers together using units like this, the Interface Message Processor, or IMP. And the idea was that the IMP would sit outside a mainframe host. So here we have the idea of the disconnection of the machine which crunches information and the machine which connects it to other machines. And the ARPANET, in its initial instance in 1969, looked like this, connecting University of California, Santa Barbara, the Stanford Research Institute, the University of Utah, and UCLA. So this was the first network which successfully disconnected a human operator from where information was analyzed, where it was processed. So I think the idea that, the Massian space-time compression idea that the internet necessarily brings things together needs to be treated with some little bit of caution, or at least qualification rather than caution. Now, the idea of disconnection was picked up by other key figures in the ARPANET environment, one of whom was JCR Licklider, who was president, that's a bit grand, isn't it? Director of ARPA's Information Technology Processing Office between, I think it was 1960 and 1963, who wrote a series of extremely influential papers on how ARPANET-like technology might be used. So in an extremely important paper called Man-Computer Symbiosis, published in 1960, he envisages the emergence of thinking centers to incorporate the functions of present-day libraries together with anticipated advances, etc. So once again, I think this is a conceptual disconnection of the human being, using a library, using a thinking center, using a facility, using a function, and those things themselves. Oh, don't do this to me. PowerPoint. Oh, there we go. So in what he called the idea of separable functions, he said that any present-day large-scale computer is too fast and too costly for real-time cooperative thinking with one man. So the functions of the computer, the functions of the thinking machine, needed to be separated out from the act of using them. So Licklider was also extremely important in pushing the idea of the machine-to-machine network. So I think although his 1960 paper is called Man-Computer Symbiosis, and incidentally, I know the gendered language makes us all cringe these days, but you know this was, this was of its time, so to say. So essentially this was about taking the human out of the machine and having them work together as two separate parts. The third person I want to, the third man's work, the work of the third man I want to introduce is another ARPANET person, who is Paul, the RAND Corporation's Paul Bryan, who essentially developed the idea of the distributed network, which took the idea of dislocation even further. So when he was talking about this, when he was developing this idea, he sort of noted the idea. So this is the Strangelove scenario, whereby the central command and communications infrastructure is taken out in a nuclear strike. He put forward the idea that a distributed network was needed to ensure that communications could continue to get through, even if one node in that network was knocked out. Paul C. Barron, his name is. I think I fluffed that a little bit before. So in this famous diagram from his report from the RAND Corporation, he talks about three models of networks. So there's the centralized network, the decentralized, and the distributed. So essentially, if a centralized network is taken out at the center, then the whole network goes down. If a decentralized network of networks is struck, then one aspect of that network might be closed down. But under a distributed network, that can keep functioning. So I think this further enforces this idea of kind of disconnection, of removal of the functions of the human and the machine. Now, one of my favorite sort of aspects of this, I think, is when we look to 1978 and the ARPANET completion report. So when the ARPANET project was finally wound up, they talk about the biggest single surprise being the popularity of its network email function. So I think this harks back to what I was saying on the development of earlier networks, is that there are a certain amount of unintended consequences and unintended components of this kind of development. So nobody thought that, engineers at different ARPANET nodes sending each other electronic mails would catch on. But of course, what eventually became email became a fundamental communication which dominated IT for a very, very long time. And it says there, with hindsight, one can easily see the reasons for the success. So this, I think, underscores that point, that the history of the internet or the web or of network technology is always a story of multivariate factors and different kinds of invention coming together in different ways and often working in very unexpected ways. So I'm now going to jump forward in both time and concept to the idea of reconnection. So the Sputnik launch in 1957 sort of politically kicked off the whole ARPANET episode of telecommunications history, but more indirectly, it also led to another equally important set of technological developments, which was the development of GPS. So in 19 actually, I'll go back a slide and come back to that one shortly. So in 1957, the launch of Sputnik had created a necessity to track space-going objects, and scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology had figured out that by triangulating the sound waves coming from an object, they were able to locate its position absolutely precisely. And through a series of iterations, this led to the development of terrestrial GPS technology. Now, for the first 25 years or so of its life, GPS was a purely military infrastructure. It was only available to, to the US military, the Army, Navy, and Air Force. But then in 1983, there was another key point of the Cold War, 1st of September, when Korean Airlines flight 007 from New York to Seoul, it would have to be 007, wouldn't it? Inevitable, really, strayed into Soviet airspace and was shot down by the Soviet Air Force. So it accidentally transgressed Soviet airspace and was shot down. So this was one of several points in the period of the Cold War from, I guess, the 1960s to the 1980s, where the Cold War very nearly became a hot war. President Ronald Reagan promised very robust response, and it was all very, very hairy for a while. But this got people thinking, this got governments thinking, particularly the US government thinking about civilian use of GPS. So if that flight had GPS technology available to it, it would not have strayed into Soviet airspace and would not have been shot down. So at that point, the rules around the availability of GPS started being relaxed. So airliners airlines started having access to this technology at that point, but the public didn't. In 1990, the US government scrambled the GPS signal and made it available for general public consumption, but in a deprecated, scrambled form, so it wasn't as accurate as the version available to the US military. And this coincided in a set of technological developments in handheld devices and also the launch of additional GPS satellites throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. In 1999, there was the first integration of a GPS receiver with a handheld telephone, which I think probably had about a 2-hour battery life and could, maybe help you find at least which mountain you'd got lost on, if not exactly where you were on the mountain that you got lost on. But then in 2000, with the lessening of Cold War tensions, then President Bill Clinton announced that the GPS signal would no longer be scrambled and that it would be made generally available to the public. Moment. So this, I think, starts to get us closer to this idea of reconnection of humans and technology and network technology. By the way, can you hear me all right? I've just had a notice on my computer, ironically enough, that I have a bad network connection. Am I still hearable?
It's fine. It's fine.
Oh, yeah,
yes,
great.
It's fine.
Yeah, it's great timing, wasn't it? So this, I think, so the idea that a GPS signal could be, available to anyone, obviously started conditioning the way that people started interacting with the web, with the internet, particularly alongside the development of the smartphone and the app, for example. This on the screen here is a nice example from a few years ago, 5 years ago, when it was noted that tourists were coming to the Greenwich Royal Observatory, where the 0 degrees longitudinal prime meridian comes through the Greenwich Observatory and is visible on the ground in a brass strip, as you can see there. Now, when the prime meridian was first measured in the 18th century, it was, of course, not using unscrambled GPS technology. It was using, I guess, astrolabe sextant technology. And it is in a slightly different place from the meridian as recorded by GPS. So when tourists come to take their photos standing astride the meridian, they look at the GPS geolocation of the photo and see it's slightly out. So for a while, apparently, according to this article, the scientists at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich were occasionally contacted by people saying, by the way, do you know your meridian is in the wrong place? Which is another one of these unintended consequences. But I think this idea, this kind of multi-causal re-engagement of technology, people, and place is a really interesting framework to think about where space-time compression has brought us. And of course, the integration of GPS technology with with other kinds of apps like restaurant reviews is now absolutely part of the course. And I was actually in another conference on this topic this morning, and there was an interesting paper on the kind of the dehumanizing, the disconnected aspects of GPS. Which one of us has not simply blindly followed the blue dot on our phone because we are confident that it will take us where we want to go? So in my title, I promised a review from the Cold War to COVID. So obviously, the last 2 or 3 months have prompted us all to rethink our relationship with technology in place in lots of unanticipatable ways. And one little project that I've undertaken just since the start of lockdown is I have kept what I am terming a GPS diary of where I have been. Just for the record, my family and I have stuck absolutely rigidly to the UK government's rules on what you can do and where you can go and who you can go with. So the pathways that you see here have kind of expanded in the last few weeks as lockdown restrictions have lifted. But you can see, so I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in the top left, there is this lake that we frequently take walks around. So we are getting a kind of build-up of lines around there. You have different, when the restrictions lifted and we could go a bit further afield, there is another kind of walk we took there and so forth. So you can see, in a sense, use technology, locative technology as a way of mapping your own engagement and disengagement with the world. So to give you an idea of scale, this red star is my office in London, which would be my daily commute, as you can see there. And just with the exception of these 2 longer trips, you can really see how much one's world has shrunk, as a result of the restrictions. I've also, by the way, in this period, been documenting what I call social distancing desire lines. So, you can actually track the way that pathways have expanded and multiplied as a result of people avoiding one another under social distancing regulations. And that's something I think I may at some point get round to writing up in a bit more detail. But in the meantime, I'm sort of wandering towards my conclusion here. I think this illustrates the way that a locative specific technology such as GPS both brings us closer to the web that tracks us through our daily lives, but also separates us from the environment around us. So this line is obviously completely separate from the environment around me. It is separate from me in that I didn't create it, my phone did. But I think it is, it illustrates this idea of space-time compression, which seemed relatively linear and straightforward, if multifaceted in 1991, is actually very much more complex now. So I'm going to finish with another quote from Massey, where she says, it is a sense of place, an understanding of its character, which can only be constructed by linking that place to places beyond. And I think she was absolutely right when she said that, and in fact, extremely prescient. But I think the conception of what is meant by a place in the real world and in the digital world is very much more complicated than anything she could have imagined. So I think that I've probably gone a little over time, actually, so I'm going to stop there and say thank you very much. I will try and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Stuart. It was very insightful, very challenging also to think about place and our connection to place and how it evolved along with the change of the technology. I think we have some questions. I don't know if you can see the chat.
Oh yes.
If you can't, I can read the questions, but if you go straight up, you can see.
Yeah. Yes, I've got the questions. Well, I've got the chat anyway.
So let me see. Okay, I think that the first one is from Patricia. A question. It is fascinating how the concept of place has expanded, changed with the World Wide Web. How do you think the perception of space in new generations or digital natives is different to ours, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that digital natives, I guess these are kind of people who have grown up, inured with technology and, have never known a time when, we were not, perennially connected. Well, I mean, I would guess that, metaphors such as cyberspace mean something slightly different. I mean, it's obviously going to be there's much less friction in contacting people, be it on social media or whatever, than, when I remember from the first 10, 15 years of my life. So I would guess that there is that aspect to it, but also I think one interest, certainly we take the example of GPS integrated with other kinds of application. I mean, if you've got your phone and you're following a map, the blue dot is always in the middle. So, you would always see yourself at the center of the map. If you've been brought up having to navigate using paper maps, then you have to, as it were, navigate the journey before you use it. However, if you're inured with the kind of technology that I've been talking about, you probably have a different approach to wayfinding and a different approach to configurational geography. There's probably lots of different answers to that question. That's the best one I can think of.
Of course. Next question is from Deborah Sutton. What is the role of European imperialism in bringing together these early disparate and disconnected technology innovations? In 1902, the British Imperial Defence Committee proudly announced that the cable system no longer depended on stations on foreign territory. There is a similar geopolitics in more recent digital compressions of time and space?
Yeah, it's another really great question. I mean, yes, the so-called thin red line, which connected Britain and its dominions in the 19th century, was absolutely a key part of the imperial project. It was greatly accelerated in the run-up to the First World War, and yes, was absolutely a project of the imperial machine, as it were. I mean, I would say that it's not in the present day just an aspect of European imperialism, but almost Western imperialism. I mean, all the technological platforms behind these technologies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, which is enabling us to do this, are all platforms which condition digital geography in a particular way. And it's not altruistic, it is for profit. It is to make money either through selling products or directing advertising, or by promoting products or places or persons which make them money. I mean, I read somewhere how many billions of dollars Twitter makes every time Donald Trump tweets, and it makes you sick, it really does. But even on open platforms, like, for example, the OpenStreetMap project, this crowdsourced Wikipedia maps, which, even where there is no kind of centralized control, there's been some really interesting work done on how minorities, are represented or are not represented. So the geographer Monica Stevens has done some really great work on OpenStreetMap, demonstrating that most OpenStreetMap contributors are essentially white, middle class, male, sort of educated, computer literate people. And it's generally the features represented on OpenStreetMap that are of interest to that demographic. And features of interest to other demographics are much less so. So I think there is a rather more insidious form of imperialism at play with these things, which is much less obvious than than we might see in the pages of a history book talking about the thin red line. So yeah, it's really complicated, that.
Yeah, your final remark is just very, very, very keen to it. Yeah. Again, another question from Patricia. Marshall, for instance, says that the key political driver for the world continues to be our physical geography. In which ways do you think the World Wide Web has changed the politics of geography?
Key political. Well, I would guess we probably have to rethink that position as a result of the World Wide Web. I mean, I think probably the World Wide Web has changed the significance of borders, for example. I mean, I think the national border, the idea of the nation state is very much a 19th century, a product of 19th century aristocratic idealism. And the idea of the hard physical geographic border comes along with that. But there are all sorts of instances where, borders, hard geographic borders are less or almost subsumed by, by representation online. There's been a lot of, you can point to things like, the fact that Google, the way Google Maps represents countries can be very problematic. So, where it marks Crimea as being a part of and that kind of thing. I believe that, I'm sure I read this somewhere, I think the Indian government protested to the United Nations over 2 pixels on the world map on the Windows 95 startup page, which appeared to imply that Kashmir was not part of India. So yes, there are all sorts of ways in which multinational global digital platforms subvert the physical border, in one way or another.
Another question is from Ben Willis-Heath. How have tech companies, I think in part you already answered something some parts of this question. How have tech companies and researchers co-opted ideas of space to sell products to consumers? Cloud computing gives an appealing impression of disconnected connection to everywhere. But in reality, the vast majority of cloud storage servers are in the USA.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I think the idea that information is freely available and aspatial is very convenient for certain entities. And I think one key method that tech companies and some researchers possibly have used it to sell products to consumers is simply to perpetuate that myth that it's free and open and is giving you unbiased, impartial information. So when you do a search on Google Maps for businesses, or services, the businesses or services that show up on the map are the businesses and services that will show up highly in Google's ranking engines anyway. So it's all down to how advertising is being driven, and how that impression that's being given. So Agnieszka Laczynski has written a lot about this. The co-option of the idea of the neo in neo-geography. And yes, I think that's absolutely right. You're not connecting to the cloud, but to a warehouse in California. Yeah. Hello?
We have also a final comment in the chat. Javier Pereira, I'm wondering what are your thoughts related to semantic web, where the computer can help making inferences about very complex relationships of space and time, such as the space-time snapshots or other fuzzy data that is difficult to understand.
Yeah, that's another really good one. So I guess the semantic web was what the early pioneers of the World Wide Web saw as lying beyond networked collections of documents. So this is rather networked connections of information. And I've actually been looking at semantic web recently in the context of all things of digital art history, because there's a lot of very interesting research done on linking art collections using semantic web representation, which is absolutely fantastic. But one thing I've noticed is that a lot of the ontologies and a lot of the vocabularies behind that sort of work essentially reflect relationships, physical relationships between collections that are and between artworks that are already there. For me, the really interesting next stage of that is how do you bring conceptual objects into that sort of network. So, okay, I can develop a network of, say, all old master still life paintings from the National Gallery's collection from the 19th century in London. But then how would I link that to abstract networks of places or time periods or styles or canons or connoisseurships, that kind of thing. So I think, there are a lot of assumptions behind the idea of the semantic web, which is essentially that anything that can be represented as information can be linked. I think you have to look very carefully at what kind of links are actually there and what kind of links you have to imagine. And that's, that's something that I think could be really interesting to look at in the future. Completely agree with that comment. If only the nation state concept had been softened here in the UK. Yes, cannot disagree with that at all.
Okay. But in present time, regarding the COVID crisis, I think we get a clear notion of the impact that these technologies have on reconnecting us, but at the same time disconnecting us from the physical world.
Exactly.
And I think the exercise that you show us in the end, the GPS diary that you put forward, it's amazing about that. In the ways that we think our technology has an impact now as being at home most of the time. I think we have another question.
Yep.
From Amy Stanning, would it be good to have your thoughts, given COVID experience on World Wide Tech, reducing human dependency and association with particular spaces, office, making some senses, spaces of all more multifunctionally? Yes, I'm at my living room assisting a digital humanities hangout. So yes.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, there couldn't be a better time to be having this conversation, can there? I mean, I would say yes. This idea of spaces being repurposed. Yes, that's absolutely right. It's obviously we're having to all having to rethink our view of the distinction between the domestic and the professional and all of these things. I would have to say, as well as being a scholar of sorts, I'm also a manager, head of department, and a real concern I have is that this collapsing of these sorts of distinctions is very bad for, certain groups of people, people who, for whatever reason, don't have access to the kind of space that's amenable to do things like this, I guess, who have childcare commitments or family commitments which impinge on that space or might impinge on that space. So, it's wonderful that we can all keep going and keep having meetings like this throughout COVID, but it's creating some real problems, some real difficulties, which, responsible institutions have to keep in mind.
Yeah, and Sally reminded us that there are particular spaces that we miss the most. Library spaces. it's one of the things. I never guessed I would miss so much my students and the classroom. So it's kind of amazing. Also. Well, we are almost at 4. We usually, I don't know if there are many more questions. Any questions from the audience? If not, let me just thank you again, Stuart, for this wonderful talk and presentation, and thanks to all for being present here, for assisting.